Hello and welcome to Stories Behind the Songs. I'm your host Jim Tompkins, and in each episode I tell the fascinating backstory behind some of rock and pop's most iconic tracks. Today I'll be telling the story behind not just a song, but an entire album. And that album is the debut album from the band Boston. The first Boston album came out of nowhere to be a huge success in 1976. For over a dozen years, it held the record for best-selling debut album of all time. But the story behind the making of the Boston album might surprise you, as it did me, as the real story was not what initially meets the eye. As a kid growing up, I wore out that album, both sides, each song as good as the last. And on the back cover, there was a photograph of 5 band members. On the side of the liner notes, it said, "Boston is," and listed each of the 5 band members and the instruments they played. Seemed pretty straightforward to me. Boston was a band with 5 guys who came up with a bunch of songs, recorded them, and they just happened to be really awesome songs. But that's not what happened. So let's settle in and get the story straight, because the real story is better than the perceived story. The first thing is, Boston starts and ends with Tom Scholz, who is the fulcrum that the quote-unquote band Boston revolves around. It is, and always will be, his band. How did Tom Scholz wind up in rock and roll as the mastermind behind one of the most successful American bands of all time? It's an unusual story. In his youth, he learned to play piano and the keyboards, but he wasn't much of a rock and roll fan. Mainly, he was influenced at an early age by classical music. And then apparently without any experience playing in bands, off he went to MIT, where he graduated with a master's in engineering in 1969. At the age of 21, inspired by the likes of Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, he then taught himself how to play the guitar. That year, a band called Freehold placed an ad for a keyboardist, and he answered it and landed himself a job in a band. Freehold included guitarist Barry Goudreau and drummer Jim Mastia, and Scholz only played the keyboards. This was also the time he wrote his first song, an instrumental called Foreplay. For the next 6 years, he played in various bands and, over time, began to write songs and then make demo tapes of those songs. For the demos, Barry Goudreau would help him out wherever he needed help. Jim Mastia would handle the drums. Everything else was done by Scholz, including electric and acoustic guitars, bass guitar, organ, and keyboards. Initially, he used a recording studio, but then over time began to build out his own mini studio in his basement in Watertown, Mass. The role of Barry Goudreau was kind of like his sidekick. He helped Tom out with certain guitar parts and enabled them to play off of each other. Along the way, Brad Delp joined Tom and Barry Goudreau and became Tom's vocalist. He also co-wrote 2 of the songs that would ultimately make it onto the debut Boston album. Over time, Scholz honed his recording techniques, eventually putting together a half dozen or so demo songs that he sent out to different record labels. All this time, he was working as an engineer at Polaroid and using his salary to fund his investment in studio equipment and to finance demo tapes, which he initially recorded in actual professional studios. He sent these out to record companies, but he got rejection after rejection. In 1973, he formed the band Mother's Milk with Delp, Goudreau, and Mastia. That group didn't last long, but he continued working with the 3 of them to produce 6 new demos. These demos included Peace of Mind, Rock and Roll Band, Something About You, Hitch a Ride, Don't Be Afraid, and More Than a Feeling. Tom played all the instruments on the demos except for the drums, which were played by Mastia, and used self-designed equipment to create the guitar sounds he was looking for. As mentioned, he'd work during the day as a design engineer at Polaroid, then work on the music in his basement studio at night. All his life he was a tinkerer. As a kid, he'd build model airplanes and take apart and rebuild go-karts and bikes. So now he'd buy used recording equipment and modify them to suit his needs. With the exception of vocals, drums, and some guitar parts by Barry Goudreau, he recorded the songs himself. He said he would close his eyes in his basement and imagine he was playing in front of thousands of people. And obviously, it worked. Once again, Scholz sent out these demo tapes, but received, once again, rejection after rejection. Among the rejections was one from Epic Records, where a guy in the A&R department infamously said, "This band has absolutely nothing new to offer." Tom said, Being married and looking at 30 coming up, it was time to throw in the towel. So I was going to finish this last demo, sell the equipment, and stop pissing away all my money doing these stupid recordings. He previously would hand out the tapes to anyone who had an interest, including a fellow engineer at work who said he had a cousin who worked at ABC. That coworker initially forgot to pass on the tapes to his cousin. It wasn't until weeks later, after Scholz told him how Columbia had rejected him, that the engineer finally passed the tape over, and it paid off. The tapes were handed down from ABC to their subsidiary Epic Records, the same company that had tersely rejected him already. The record company had no idea he didn't have an actual proper band behind him when they signed him. Even Brad Delp didn't realize there was no band behind him. Tom Scholz says Brad didn't find that out, amazingly, until about 10 years later. To sign a deal, Epic insisted that the band audition for the company executives. So Tom had to pull something together because, of course, there really was no band. For this performance, he pulled in Delp, Barry Goudreau, Sib Hashian on drums, and Fran Sheehan, who was recorded on bass. Jim Mazdia had been the drummer Scholz was working with, but the folks at Epic weren't impressed with his drumming and wanted him replaced. According to Scholz, the performance wasn't great, but it was good enough for the Epic executives. After that audition, though, a tug-of-war takes place. Scholz insists the record be recorded right there in the basement. Epic doesn't want that. They send a producer and engineer out to his apartment to meet with him. After they look at his setup in this tiny little basement, they say, "We can't possibly record an album here." But Scholz stands his ground and says he certainly could, and that was what he was going to do. So they're at an impasse. The Epic guys start to leave, then the producer John Boylan turns back and he says to Tom, "How about this? You record the album here, send us the master tapes in LA, and we'll mix it there." Tom thinks this was a great offer, but he hesitates just a moment before answering. At that point, the producer sweetens the offer, telling Tom he'd also split the producing royalties with him 50-50. So that little hesitation gets Tom Scholz an even better deal. John Boylan's take regarding Tom Scholz's 12-track recordings was this: "I loved it and wanted to work with it," he says. "I knew what was wrong with the recordings immediately. Tom was an obvious genius, but he didn't know how to record acoustic instruments. The drums and acoustic guitars were amateurish, but the guitars sounded amazing. Tom didn't want an outside producer. He wanted to do this all himself," Boylan said matter-of-factly. "He accepted me because he knew it was politically necessary. I looked at the situation and told Charlie and Paul in a meeting that this project will sound better if Tom gets to do it the way he wants. What I could do to help it is to make his acoustics sound better and to run interference with the label while he works out of his basement." But before they could get to that stage, Boylan had to orchestrate a big-time fake-out. As he said, "I'd gotten a budget from Epic." He estimates the amount spent in the end was just $28,000. But the more important question from Epic's admin department was, "Where are you guys going to record?" Boylan explains, "There was a deal in place with the studio that required a paid union engineer be present if recording was done outside of a certain range of one of the studios, even if all he did was twiddle his thumbs. So Boylan decided to put up a smokescreen, because the idea of a union engineer sitting next to the perfectionist Scholz in his little basement in Watertown was hard to even fathom. What Boylan did was to fly the rest of the guys to Los Angeles, where they worked on some partial Scholz material, such as "Let Me Take You Home Tonight," which was co-written with Brad Delp. While they did this, Scholz remained in his basement, safe from meddling by anyone at Epic. Boylan says he paid for the equipment rentals for Scholz himself to keep up the smokescreen for Epic's auditors. There in his basement, Scholz did note-for-note replications of his basement tapes, as before handling most of the instruments himself and bringing Jim Mazdia back in for the drums on Rock and Roll Band. Said Tom, "It's a bizarre story, but that's how that first album came to be. They got basically another basement recording done the same way. The only thing that had changed was Sib Hashian played a lot of the drums instead of Jim Mazdia. I preferred the demos, but there were minor improvements technically in the mastering." That spring, Boylan returned to Boston to hear the tracks and hired a remote truck in Providence, Rhode Island, and had it come to Watertown, where it ran a snake through the basement window of Scholz's home to transfer his tracks to a 24-track deck. The tapes were taken to Los Angeles, where Boylan, Scholz, and Delp worked on the vocals. At this point, the band didn't even have a name. It was Boylan who suggested they call it Boston, and the name stuck. The deal Scholz signed with Epic was for 10 albums in 6 years. In hindsight, that sounds like an absurd expectation, even without knowing what a perfectionist Tom Scholz was. And we all know Boston didn't come close to that, and in fact only recorded 2 albums for Epic before all the lawsuits started. The album was stocked with songs that could stand their ground all on their own on FM rock radio. To this day, all 8 songs can be heard on classic rock stations. To my ears, any one of those songs could be the standout song on another band's record. The album was released on August 25, 1976, and during the late summer and early fall, Boston began to get publicity as the record sales gained steam. According to Cameron Crowe and Rolling Stone, though, there was a conscious effort to de-emphasize Scholz as the total mastermind behind Boston. The band, now really a band because you need one to perform live, began opening for bands like Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, and Foghat. Then embarked on their own headlining tour in the winter and spring of 1976-77. Boston was nominated for a Grammy Award as Best New Artist and was the first band in history to make their New York City debut at Madison Square Garden. 3 singles were released from the album: More Than a Feeling, Long Time, and Peace of Mind. Both Long Time and Peace of Mind went top 40, while More Than a Feeling made the top 5. The album peaked at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and remained on the charts for 132 weeks. It now ranks as one of the highest-selling albums of all time, selling over 17 million copies in the United States alone. Boston, the band, could have more appropriately been titled The Tom Scholz Project with a little help from his friends. Yes, Brad Delp sang the vocals. Yes, Sib Hashian played the drums, and yes, Barry Goudreau did play some guitar parts, including a phenomenal solo on Long Time. But Scholz wrote 90% of it, played almost all of the instruments, produced it, and engineered it. The success of the Boston album helped revive the popularity of mainstream rock at a time when punk and disco were taking hold of the charts. The threads of Boston can be heard in bands like Foreigner, Journey, Jefferson Starship, REO Speedwagon, and many others. And the amazing thing when you think about it, those threads all trace back to one guy making demo tapes in his basement in Watertown, Mass. Here are some other interesting facts about Boston and the Boston debut album. When Tom was working at Polaroid, at one point they were laying off some workers. His manager came to him and told him he wasn't on the firing line, but that he had to lay off other workers with families and mortgages, and wanted to know if Tom, with his music interest, was really committed to Polaroid. Tom said to him, "Ed, that's like 1,000,000 to 1 shot. There's no chance this is going to amount to anything. I just do that for a hobby." The manager says, "Okay, I'm just checking." A year later, when Tom quit and was heading out the door of Polaroid, the manager came running after him and says, "I thought this wasn't going to amount to anything." The one song on the album that was recorded in that studio in California by the band was Let Me Take You Home Tonight, because it was written partially by Brad Delp. If you listen to that song, the last song on the album, it does sound sonically different from the rest of the album. The original title of Hitch a Ride was San Francisco Day. You can hear that original demo on YouTube, which is very similar to the original, though the sound is not as high quality and some of the lyrics are changed, such as when Delp sings, "San Francisco Day, love's just a smile away." San Francisco Day, love's just a smile away. When he went out to California to record the vocals, the weather was not easy on Brad Delp's voice. He felt it wasn't his best effort. In fact, he felt the singing on the original demos they did was superior. But that just goes to show that artists can really be objective, because Delp's vocals on the album are unbelievably good. They're legendary, and without them, the Boston sound wouldn't be the Boston sound. When he originally began sending out demo tapes to different record companies, Scholz's method was to simply look up the company's address on the back of an album, then send it out. There was no attempt at networking or going through a friend of a friend, so it's not a big surprise that those early demo tapes were rejected by so many labels. The Mary Ann in the song More Than a Feeling was an older cousin of Tom's. He had a crush on her when he was 13. From the lyric, "I see my Mary Ann walking away," said Scholz, it was a kid's grade school crush, and her name fit, and it worked out perfectly. That wraps up the story of the debut album by Boston. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back soon with another story behind a great rock and roll song.